The wind on the Montana plains did not just blow. It scoured. It was a living, hungry thing that stripped the paint from wood and the hope from men. In the late 1880s, the territory was a place of brutal extremes, where the sky stretched so wide it felt as though it might swallow the earth whole. Lucas Ward stood on a ridge overlooking the northern line of his property, his gloved hands gripping the wire cutters until his knuckles turned white. It was late autumn, but the air already carried the metallic tang of coming snow. The summer had been merciless, a drought that turned the soil to gray powder and left the creek beds looking like cracked bones. He had spent the morning tightening fence lines that kept a herd so sparse it hardly seemed worth the effort. He was a man in his early 30s, though the sun and the wind had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. He was broad-shouldered and built for heavy labor, moving with a deliberate, quiet economy. He did not waste motion, and he did not waste words. To the people of Dusty Creek, he was a ghost in flesh and blood. They said he was cursed. They whispered that his heart had frozen solid the winter his wife died out here, alone in the drifts, while he was miles away trying to save a heifer. They were not entirely wrong. Lucas finished the splice in the wire and looked out toward the horizon. The mountains were jagged purple teeth in the distance, indifferent to his struggle. He wiped a smudge of grease from his cheek, mounted his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Hammer, and turned toward the faint rutted track that led to town. It was supply day. He went to Dusty Creek once a week, regular as a clock, not because he craved company, but because survival demanded flour, coffee, and nails. Dusty Creek lived up to its name. It was a cluster of weather-beaten buildings clinging to the earth as if afraid the wind would carry them off to the Dakotas. The main street was a wide scar of dirt, rutted by wagon wheels and littered with horse manure. The tension in the air was thicker than the dust. You could feel it in the way men walked, hands hovering near their belts, and in the way shopkeepers watched the street. The cattle baron Ephraim Cole had been squeezing the life out of the smaller ranchers and farmers, cutting off water rights and buying up debt, and the town was fracturing under the pressure. Lucas tied Hammer to the rail outside the general store and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that seemed out of place in the gloom of the interior. The air smelled of pickle brine, sawdust, and cured tobacco. Silas, the storekeeper, nodded to him from behind the counter. Lucas nodded back, moving through the aisles to gather his necessities. He was measuring out a pound of coffee beans when voices drifted over from the dry goods section. Two women stood by the bolts of calico, their bonnets close together, their voices pitched in that hushed, venomous tone reserved for scandal. One of them was Mrs. Miller, the banker's wife. "I saw her again this morning," she said, snapping a length of ribbon between her fingers, walking right down the center of the street, as if she has not a singular shame in her soul. "The Hale woman," the other replied with a sniff. "Well, what do you expect? A woman who behaves like that, singing in a saloon like a common harlot. They say she is no better than she should be. My husband says it is a disgrace that the sheriff allows her to stay." Lucas paused, his hand hovering over the coffee scoop. He knew who they meant. Clara Hale. The name was common currency in Dusty Creek, usually exchanged with a sneer. "She will come to a bad end." "Mrs." Miller said with grim satisfaction. "Just you wait. A woman cannot fall that far and expect to land soft. She is looking for a protector. Mark my words. But who would have her? Damaged goods." Lucas finished filling his sack, his jaw set hard. He had no patience for gossip. It was a poison that rotted a town from the inside, and he had tasted enough of it after his own wife passed. He walked to the counter, the heavy thud of his boots silencing the women. They looked at him, their eyes widening slightly, and then turned away, pretending to admire the fabric. He paid Silas in silence and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. He was stowing the supplies in his saddlebags when he saw her. Clara Hale was walking on the opposite side of the street. She carried a bundle of mending wrapped in brown paper, clutching it to her chest as if it were a shield. She was in her mid-20s, a woman who might have been beautiful if she were not so visibly exhausted. Her dress was a faded blue cotton, washed so many times it was nearly gray, and he could see the careful, desperate stitching where it had been patched at the hem. But it was the way she walked that caught him. Her boots were worn down at the heels, yet she kept her chin lifted, staring straight ahead, refusing to look at the men loitering in front of the saloon who called out to her. "Give us a smile, Clara!" one shouted, followed by a chorus of rough laughter. "How much for a song, darlin'?" another yelled. "Or do you charge extra for the private ones?" She did not flinch, though Lucas saw her knuckles whiten around her bundle as she passed the hitching rail where he stood. She glanced up. For a second, the noise of the street faded. Her eyes were dark, shadowed by fatigue and a wariness that reminded Lucas of a cornered animal. But beneath the fear, he saw something else, a fierce, burning pride. She looked at him, bracing herself for another insult, another leer. Lucas did not smile. He did not sneer. He simply looked at her with a quiet, grave intensity. He saw the loneliness in her, a vast, hollow ache that mirrored the one he carried in his own chest. The moment stretched, suspended in the dust motes dancing between them. Then, Clara blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face at his silence, and she looked away, hurrying her pace until she disappeared around the corner of the livery stable. Lucas watched the empty space where she had been. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, a crack in the ice he had built around himself. He shook his head, mounting hammer and turning the horse toward the open plains. He had work to do. Other people's troubles were none of his concern. Clara reached her room behind the saloon and shut the door, leaning her back against the rough wood as she exhaled a shaking breath. The room was hardly more than a closet, containing a narrow cot, a wash basin with a cracked rim, and a single chair. The air smelled faintly of stale beer and old wood, seeping in through the thin walls from the bar room next door. She moved to the small table and set down her bundle. From her pocket, she withdrew 3 coins, her payment for mending the sheriff's torn coat. She counted them out on the wood. It was enough for rent, and perhaps a sack of cornmeal, but not enough for firewood. She would have to sleep in her coat again tonight. She sat on the edge of the cot, rubbing her aching legs. The voices from the street still echoed in her mind. Damaged goods, fallen woman. It had not always been this way. She closed her eyes, and the memory came, unbidden and sharp as a knife. She remembered the parlor of the Cole Ranch house, where she had been hired as a seamstress 6 months ago. It was the best job she had found since arriving in the territory, and she had been grateful. Then came the afternoon when Ephraim Cole's son, Thomas, had found her alone in the hallway. She remembered the smell of brandy on his breath, the way he had blocked her path, smiling that lazy, entitled smile. She remembered saying no. She remembered saying it clearly. She remembered the shock of his hand grabbing her wrist, the struggle, the tearing of her sleeve, and the terror that had frozen her blood. She had fought him off, scratching his face, and had run straight to the sheriff. That was her mistake. She had believed that truth mattered, but Ephraim Cole owned the town, and he certainly owned the sheriff. Within 2 days, the story had been twisted. Thomas claimed she had lured him, that she had tried to blackmail him when he refused her advances. The town, terrified of Cole and eager for a scandal, had devoured the lie. She was fired, evicted from her boarding house, and branded a seductress. Now, she was trapped. She could not afford a stagecoach ticket out of Dusty Creek, and no respectable family would hire her. She survived by mending clothes for the few who didn't care about her reputation and singing in the saloon on weekend nights for spare change. Clara opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were red from the cold, but they were steady. She would not let them win. She would save every penny, and come spring, she would leave this place and never look back. That evening, the saloon was crowded. The air was thick with the blue haze of tobacco smoke and the sharp reek of whiskey. Men crowded the tables, playing cards and shouting over the din. Clara stood on the small raised platform in the corner. She wore her best dress, the only one without patches, and kept her eyes fixed on a point above the heads of the crowd. The piano player, a tired old man named Jeb, struck the opening chords. She began to sing. Her voice was not a saloon girl's voice. It was not brassy or loud. It was a clear, haunting soprano that cut through the noise like a beam of light through murky water. She sang an old ballad about a lover lost at sea, a song of grief and enduring hope. Hard times come again no more. Gradually, the shouting at the card tables died down. The clinking of glasses softened. Men who had been ready to jeer found themselves staring into their drinks, caught by the raw, naked sorrow in the sound. Outside, in the deepening twilight, Lucas Ward pulled his horse to a halt. He was on his way back to the ranch, having stayed late to speak with the blacksmith about a broken plowshare. He had intended to ride straight past the saloon, but the voice stopped him. It drifted out over the swinging doors, mournful and pure. It sounded like the wind singing through the wires on a lonely night. It sounded like everything he tried not to feel. Lucas sat motionless in the saddle, the reins loose in his hand. He listened to the way her voice trembled on the high notes, not from weakness, but from emotion. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to dismount, to walk through those doors, and to see the woman who could sing like that in a place like this. He imagined walking in. He imagined the silence of the room. He imagined standing between her and the crowd. The horse stamped a hoof, breaking the spell. Lucas shook his head, angry at his own foolishness. He was a rancher with a failing herd and a haunted house. He had nothing to offer a woman, least of all one with the whole town against her. He gathered the reins, clicked his tongue to hammer, and rode away into the gathering dark, the song fading behind him but echoing in his mind for miles. 3 days later, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. It started with a drop in temperature so sudden it felt like a door had been left open to the Arctic. By noon, the wind was screaming down from the north, carrying ice crystals that stung the skin like ground glass. It was early for a blizzard, even for Montana, but the weather cared nothing for the calendar. Lucas was 5 miles from his house, up near the rocky ravines that marked the western edge of his land. He had been looking for a stray calf that had separated from the herd. The snow was coming down hard now, a white curtain that reduced the world to a radius of 20 feet. He had given up on the calf. The priority now was his own survival. He turned Hammer around, pulling his heavy buffalo hide coat tighter around his neck. The wind was a deafening roar, drowning out all sound. He kept his head down, trusting the horse to find the footing on the treacherous, ice-slicked trail. They were passing a narrow draw, a place where the land dipped sharply between jagged boulders, when Hammer shied violently, nearly unseating him. "Steady," Lucas growled, tightening his grip. He looked to see what had spooked the animal. Through the swirling white, he saw a dark shape at the bottom of the ravine. It looked like a fallen log, but logs did not have saddles. Lucas squinted, wiping snow from his eyelashes. It was a horse, lying on its side, its leg twisted at a sickening angle, and beside it, half buried in the gathering drift, was a person. He did not think. He swung out of the saddle, his boots crunching into the snow, and slid down the embankment. The wind tore at his hat, but he ignored it. He reached the figure. It was a woman. She was sprawled face down, her dark hair fanned out over the snow like spilled ink. He rolled her over gently. It was Clara Hale. Lucas felt a jolt of shock that nearly stopped his heart. Her face was marble white, her lips blue. There was a deep, ugly gash on her right thigh where the fabric of her dress had been torn away, likely from the fall or the thrashing of the horse. The snow beneath her leg was stained a bright, shocking crimson. "Miss Hale!" he shouted over the wind, shaking her shoulder. "Clara!" She did not open her eyes, but a low moan escaped her lips. Her skin was ice cold to the touch. She was already in the grip of hypothermia. He looked at her horse. The animal was dead, its neck broken in the fall. She must have been trying to take a shortcut across the ridge. perhaps trying to leave town before the storm hit, and the horse had slipped. Lucas looked up at the sky. The storm was intensifying. The whiteout was total now. Town was 10 miles away, back over open, undefended ground. If he tried to take her there, they would both freeze to death before they reached the first building. His ranch was closer. It was isolated, lonely, and cut off. But it had walls, a roof, and fire. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "All right." He pulled off his heavy coat. The cold hit him like a physical blow, punching the air from his lungs. But he wrapped the coat around Clara, tucking the thick fur against her body. He lifted her. She was light, terrifyingly light, a bundle of fragile bones and freezing flesh. Getting her up the embankment was a brutal struggle. His boots slipped on the frozen rocks. He gasped for air, his muscles burning, clutching her tight to keep her from jarring her injured leg. When he finally reached the trail, Hammer was waiting, head low against the wind. Lucas hoisted Clara up, settling her across the saddlebow, then swung up behind her. He pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her to shield her from the wind and to hold her steady. "Hold on," he said into her ear, though he knew she could not hear him. "We are going home." The ride back was a nightmare. The world had vanished, replaced by a screaming void of white. There was no sky, no earth, only the biting cold and the rhythmic crunch of Hammer's hooves. Lucas navigated by memory and instinct, feeling the slope of the land. Every few minutes, he shook Clara gently. "Stay with me," he yelled. "Do not sleep. You hear me? Do not sleep." She murmured something unintelligible, her head lolling against his shoulder. He felt the heat of her blood soaking through his trousers where her leg pressed against his. She was bleeding too much. Time lost its meaning. It might have been an hour, it might have been a day. His own hands were losing feeling, his face numb. He began to talk to her, just to keep his own mind focused, to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. "Just a little farther," he rasped. "There is a warm stove. There is coffee. You hold on. Clara, you fought this whole damn town. You do not get to die in the snow. You are too stubborn for that." She stirred slightly. "Get away," she whispered, a ghostly sound lost in the gale. "Nobody is getting you," Lucas said grimly. "I have you." Finally, a dark shape loomed out of the white. The barn. Lucas nearly sobbed with relief. He guided the horse to the lee side of the house, sliding off with stiff, clumsy legs. He caught Clara as she slid down, her weight nearly dragging him to the ground. He kicked the front door open and stumbled inside, dragging her with him. He slammed the door shut against the howling fury of the storm. The silence of the house was sudden and ringing. The air inside was cold, but it was still. Lucas did not stop to rest. He carried her to the bedroom, a small, austere room dominated by a large iron bed frame. It was the only decent bed in the house, the one he and his wife had shared, though he had slept on the cot in the main room for years. He laid Clara on the quilt. In the dim light, she looked like a broken doll. He fumbled with the matchbox on the bedside table, his fingers shaking so badly he dropped the first two. The third flared to life. He lit the kerosene lamp, and golden light flooded the room, chasing back the shadows. He turned to the fireplace in the corner of the room. Thankfully, he had laid a fire that morning before leaving. He struck another match and watched the kindling catch. Now he turned back to Clara. He pulled the buffalo coat away. The sight made his stomach turn. Her dress was soaked with blood from her hip to her knee. The fabric had frozen stiff, adhering to the wound. He touched her forehead. She was burning up with fever, yet her skin was cold. Shock. She was in deep shock. "I have to get this dress off the wound," he said aloud, his voice sounding rusty in the quiet room. He went to the kitchen, fetched a basin of water and a bottle of whiskey, and set them on the bedside table. He placed the kettle on the growing fire to boil. Then he took his hunting knife from his belt. He looked at her. He was a man who had lived alone for 3 years. He had not touched a woman, not intimately, not casually, in all that time. Now, He had to cut the clothes off a woman the whole town called a harlot, a woman he barely knew, to save her life. He felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. He took a breath, steeling himself. He was a rancher. He had stitched horses and cattle. He had set bones. This was flesh and blood. It was survival. He sat on the edge of the bed. Clara's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. "I am sorry, Clara," he whispered. He slid the sharp blade of the knife under the hem of her skirt, just above the knee, and began to cut upward through the blood-stiffened cotton. The sound of the fabric tearing seemed incredibly loud. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the window panes in their frames. The snow piled up against the glass, sealing them in, for tonight, and likely for days to come. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only this room, the flickering firelight, and the woman bleeding on his bed. Lucas Ward steadied his hands, dipped a cloth into the water, and prepared to work. The knife blade sliced through the wet, heavy wool of Clara's dress with a sound like tearing parchment. Lucas held his breath, his hand steady despite the tremors of cold that still rattled his own bones. The fire in the hearth was roaring now, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls, but the heat had not yet penetrated the corners of the room. He peeled back the layers of fabric, the skirt, the petticoat, trying to preserve her modesty even as he worked to save her leg. He felt a flush of heat rise up his neck, a sharp, uncomfortable awareness of her skin against the rough blankets. He was a man who had lived in silence and solitude for years, and the sudden presence of a woman, laid out on his marriage bed, felt like a violation of a sacred, mournful space. But the sight of the wound drove the embarrassment from his mind. It was a jagged, ugly tear running from her mid-thigh down toward the knee. The flesh was pale and angry, the edges rimmed with the blue-black of bruising where the horse must have crushed her against the rocks. Dirt and debris from the trail were ground into the cut. "Easy now," he murmured, though she was deeply unconscious. Her head rolled on the pillow, her face ash-gray in the lamplight. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the bedside table. He uncorked it with his teeth, the sharp fumes biting his nose. He poured a generous amount onto a clean rag, then hesitated. This was going to hurt. It was going to hurt like fire. He pressed the soaked rag to the wound. Clara's body jerked as if struck by lightning. A low, guttural cry tore from her throat, and her eyes flew open, wide and unseeing, filled with panic. Her hands scrabbled at the quilt, knuckles turning white. "Hold still," Lucas ordered, his voice rough with tension. He pressed harder, needing to clean the grit out before infection could take hold. In this country, a bad infection was a death sentence as surely as a bullet. Clara gasped, her chest heaving. The pain cut through the fog of her hypothermia, dragging her into a sharp, agonizing clarity. She looked at him, but her eyes were not focusing on his face. She was looking through him, lost in a haze of agony and fear. Lucas discarded the rag and picked up the needle he had threaded with silk. He had sterilized it in the flame of the lamp, but it was a crude tool for such delicate work. He pinched the edges of the skin together. "I have to stitch it," he told her, not knowing if she understood. "I am sorry." He drove the needle through the skin. Clara screamed, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the howling wind outside. She tried to pull away, but Lucas used his free hand to pin her leg to the mattress, his grip firm. "Almost done," he lied. He had barely started. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering with a sound like dry bones rattling together. As he prepared for the third stitch, her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked at him then, really looked at him, her dark eyes swimming with a desperate, terrified plea. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a broken rasp. Lucas paused, the needle hovering. "I have to. Clara, it will not heal otherwise." She shook her head against the pillow, her breath hitching. "Don't! Stop!" The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy, for a heartbeat. Lucas froze. The phrase twisted in his mind, filtered through the poison of the town's gossip. Don't stop. It was what a lover said in the heat of passion. It was what the men in the saloon joked she said to anyone with a coin in his pocket. For a split second, a dark, shameful heat flared in Lucas's chest, a mix of revulsion and a sudden, unwanted spike of desire. He looked at her, seeing the disarray of her hair, the exposed curve of her leg, and the way her lips parted. Was she delirious? Was she repeating some memory of the men the town said she entertained? Then he looked into her eyes. There was no seduction there. There was only a naked primal terror. She was not asking for pleasure. She was begging him not to give up on her. She was terrified that he would see the damage, see the trouble she was, and leave her there to bleed out in the cold. She was asking him to finish the job of saving her. Shame washed over Lucas, cold and bracing. He cursed himself silently for the thought. He was no better than the gossips in the general store, judging a dying woman by the lies of small-minded men. "I am not stopping," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. He shifted his grip on her leg, his touch turning gentler. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere until you are whole again." She seemed to sag into the mattress, the fight draining out of her. Her hand slipped from his wrist, falling limp onto the coverlet. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay." He finished the stitching with a focus he had never possessed before. His large, calloused hands, usually suited for branding cattle or mending fences, moved with a surprising grace. He tied off the final knot and dressed the wound with clean bandages, wrapping the leg tightly. When he was done, she had drifted back into a half-sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. He stood up, his back aching from the tension. He looked at the bloody, tattered remains of her dress. It was ruined, and it was wet. He could not leave her in it. He went to the heavy oak wardrobe in the corner and pulled out one of his own work shirts, a thick gray flannel that smelled of cedar and soap. He approached the bed again. "Clara," he said softly, "we need to get you out of these wet things." She did not answer. He worked quickly, his face burning. He unbuttoned the bodice of her dress, trying to look only at the fastenings. He peeled the wet fabric down, lifting her shoulders to slide the dress off. He saw the curve of her collarbone, the pale slope of her shoulder, the delicate fragility of her ribcage. She was too thin. He averted his eyes, focusing on the far wall where the firelight played against the logs. He maneuvered her arms into the sleeves of his shirt. It swallowed her, the cuffs hanging inches past her fingertips. He buttoned it up to her chin, creating a shroud of gray flannel that hid her away. He pulled the heavy quilt up to her neck, tucking the edges in tight around her body, swaddling her like a child. Only then did he allow himself to look at her face again. She looked small in the center of the large bed, drowned in his clothes and his blankets. Lucas walked to the window and scraped a circle in the frost on the glass. Outside, the world was gone. The snow was a solid wall of white, piling up against the logs. The wind battered the house, seeking any crack to enter. They were buried. He turned back to the room. He was trapped in here with a woman he barely knew, a woman the town despised, a woman who was currently sleeping in the bed where his wife had died. He pulled the rocking chair closer to the fire, sat down, and prepared to wait. Hours bled into one another. The storm outside did not relent. If anything, it grew more furious, the wind shrieking like a wounded animal. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Clara's uneven breathing. Sometime deep in the night, Clara stirred. She opened her eyes, blinking against the amber glow of the lamp. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between the freezing cold of the ravine and this warm, soft place. She smelled wood smoke and cedar. She felt heavy warmth pressing down on her. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, tearing pain in her legs slammed her back down. She gasped, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Easy," a voice said from the shadows. Clara flinched, turning her head sharply. A man was sitting in a chair by the hearth. In the dim light, he looked like a mountain, broad shoulders, dark hair, a face carved from granite. Memory rushed back. The storm, the fall, the man on the horse, the rancher. Lucas Ward. You, she croaked. Her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. Lucas stood and moved to the bedside. He poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and held it out. Drink, slowly. She struggled to lift her head. He hesitated, then slid a hand behind her neck, supporting her. His hand was warm and rough. She drank greedily, the water cool and sweet. Where, she began, then stopped to cough. Where am I? My ranch, Lucas said. He took the cup back and set it down. Found you near the ravine. Horse is dead. Leg is stitched. Clara looked down at herself. She saw the gray flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to free her hands. She felt the thick bandage on her leg under the covers. A flush of shame heated her cheeks. He had undressed her. He had seen everything. She pulled the quilt higher, her eyes darting to his face. She was used to men who expected payment for their kindness. She was used to hands that took rather than gave. She swallowed hard. I cannot pay you. I have no money. Lucas's face darkened slightly. He stepped back, putting distance between them. I did not ask for money. They always ask, she said, her voice bitter and small. Or if not money, then... She let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging in the air. Lucas looked at her, his expression unreadable. I am not them, he said simply. I brought you here because you would have died in the drift. That is all. He turned and went to the stove, ladling broth from a pot into a bowl. He brought it to her, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. Eat! You lost blood! Clara took the bowl with trembling hands. She watched him as he retreated to his chair, sitting with his back straight, eyes fixed on the fire. He was not looking at her. He was not leering. He seemed uncomfortable. Thank you, she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Eat, he repeated. The silence that followed was awkward, filled with the unspoken weight of who they were, the disgraced woman and the widower. But beneath the awkwardness, there was a tentative peace. The wind howled outside, trying to tear the roof off. But in here, the fire held the cold at bay. The fever came later. Lucas had dozed off in the chair, his chin on his chest. But the sound of Clara tossing and turning woke him instantly. He went to the bed. She was thrashing, her head moving restlessly from side to side. Her skin was burning hot to the touch, flushed with a sickly red color. No, she muttered, her voice high and thin. No, please, I didn't mean to. Lucas dipped a cloth in cool water and wiped her forehead. She leaned into the touch, seeking the cold. Shh, he soothed. You are safe. He's lying, she cried out, her eyes opening but seeing nothing. Tell them he's lying. She was back in the town, back in the moment her life had fallen apart. Lucas felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the invisible tormentors haunting her fever dreams. He wrung out the cloth and pressed it to her neck. She quieted for a moment. Then her hand shot out, grasping for something in the empty air. Lucas caught her hand, his large fingers engulfing her small, hot ones. Don't stop, she whispered again. This time, the words were different. There was no pain in them, only a terrified, childlike need. She was pleading with the darkness not to swallow her. She was begging for a tether. I am here, Lucas said, his voice rough. I am holding you. Don't leave, she whimpered. Everyone leaves. The words struck Lucas in the center of his chest. He looked at the woman gripping his hand as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. He thought of his wife, Sarah. He thought of the morning he had ridden out to check the herd, leaving her smiling at the door, only to return to a silence that would never be broken. Everyone leaves. Or they get left. He squeezed Clara's hand. I am not leaving. Clara, I am right here. She seemed to hear him. Her breathing hitched, then settled. She did not let go of his hand, and he did not pull away. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching the firelight play across her face. He felt a strange pulling sensation in his chest, a warmth that terrified him. It had been so long since he had touched another living soul with anything other than a handshake or a transaction. Holding her hand felt dangerous. It felt like opening a door he had locked and barred 3 years ago. He told himself it was just pity. She was sick. She was weak. She was a guest under his protection. But as he watched the pulse beat in her throat, he knew it was more than pity. It was a recognition. Two broken things, washed up on the same shore by the storm. The next day, the storm had not broken, but the fever had. Clara woke feeling weak as a kitten, but her mind was clear. The room was bright with the gray, diffuse light of a snow-buried day. Lucas was not in the chair. She pushed herself up, wincing as her leg throbbed. She looked around the room. It was masculine and sparse, a heavy dresser, a washstand, the iron bed. There were no curtains, only wooden shutters. Her eyes landed on a small shelf near the window. There was a single photograph in a silver frame, polished to a shine. She stared at it. It was a tintype of a woman. She was sitting in a chair, her hands folded in her lap, wearing a dress with a high lace collar. She was smiling, a soft, gentle smile that seemed to light up the grainy image. The door opened, and Lucas entered, carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped when he saw her sitting up. "You are awake," he said. He sounded relieved. "Yes," she pulled the blanket up. "The fever broke. I think," he nodded, kneeling to feed the fire. The scent of cold air and pine clung to him. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. "Who is she?" Clara asked softly, gesturing to the photograph. Lucas stiffened. His back was to her, and she saw the muscles in his shoulders tense under his shirt. He placed a log on the grate with deliberate, slow care. "That is Sarah," he said without turning around. "My wife." "She is beautiful," Clara said. "She was." Lucas stood up and dusted his hands on his trousers. He turned to face her, his expression closed and hard. "She died 3 years ago." "I heard," Clara said, daring to push a little. "The town, they say it was winter." "It was winter," Lucas said, his voice flat. "I was out checking fences. A blizzard blew in, fast, like this one. She went into labor early. By the time I got back," he looked at the floor. "The house was cold." The guilt in his voice was so heavy it almost had a physical weight. He did not blame the storm. He blamed himself. Clara felt a sudden, piercing ache for him. She knew what it was like to be blamed for things you could not control. "It wasn't your fault," she said. Lucas looked up, his eyes flashing. "I was not here. That is my fault." "You were working," Clara insisted. "You were trying to keep the ranch alive. You could not have known." He looked away, staring out the frosted window. "It is a man's job to know, to protect." Clara looked at her hands. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "you can do everything right, and the world still crushes you." Lucas turned back to her, his gaze intense. "Is that what happened to you, with the coal boy?" Clara froze. She had not expected him to ask. She had expected him to ignore the rumors, or to believe them silently. "You heard the stories," she said, her voice tight. "I heard what the town says." Lucas said, "I want to hear what you say." Clara took a breath. She looked at the quilt, tracing the stitching with her finger. "I needed work. Ephraim Cole hired me to sew for his wife. I thought it was a blessing." She laughed bitterly. "Thomas, he is the golden son. He thinks everything belongs to him, the land, the horses, the women." She looked up at Lucas, her chin lifting in that defiant way he had seen on the street. "He cornered me in the hallway. He was drunk. He put his hands on me. I said no. I fought him. I scratched his face." She paused, waiting for the skepticism, waiting for the question, "But what were you wearing? But did you smile at him?" "I went to the sheriff," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I thought the law was for everyone, but Thomas told them I invited him. He told them I tried to blackmail him when he rejected me, and because he is a Cole, and I am nobody, they believed him." She stopped. her chest heaving. She searched Lucas's face, bracing herself for the disgust. But there was no disgust. Lucas's jaw was set so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes were not cold. They were burning. "Ephraim Cole," Lucas said, the name sounding like a curse. "And his son. They are rot in this valley." Clara blinked, surprised. You believe me?" "I have seen Thomas Cole with a horse," Lucas said darkly. "A man who treats an animal with cruelty will treat a person worse. I believe you." "Clara." The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. "I believe you." Clara felt something inside her chest crack open. For 6 months, she had carried the weight of the town's judgment. She had shouted her truth at walls that would not listen. And now, this quiet, haunted man, standing in his snowbound cabin, had simply accepted it as fact. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and fast. She wiped them away angrily. "Thank you," she whispered. Lucas walked over to the bed. The anger faded from his face, replaced by a strange softness. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Not the town pariah, not the patient, but the woman who had fought back. "You should rest," he said gently. "The soup is still warm." The storm raged for 2 more days. By the 3rd evening, the isolation had created a strange, suspended reality. The world outside did not exist. There was only the fire, the smell of coffee, and the 2 of them. The cabin was drafty. The wind found every gap in the chinking, sending fingers of ice-cold air across the floor. Lucas had piled every blanket he owned onto the bed, but Clara was still shivering. "I can't get warm," she said, her teeth chattering. The fire was dying down, and the wood pile inside was running low. Lucas would have to go out in the morning to the woodshed, but for tonight, they had to make do. Lucas looked at her. She was buried under 3 quilts, but her lips were pale. He looked at the empty chair where he had been sleeping, wrapped in his coat. It was freezing over there. He hesitated. He looked at the photograph of Sarah on the shelf. Then he looked at Clara, shivering in the bed. "Move over," he said quietly. Clara's eyes widened. "What?" "The body heat is the only way," Lucas said, his voice practical, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "You are freezing. Clara, I will stay on top of the covers." Clara hesitated, then scooted to the far side of the mattress against the wall. Lucas blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. He took off his boots and lay down on top of the quilts, his back to her. The mattress dipped under his weight. He was close, so close. "Is that better?" he asked into the dark. "Yes," she whispered. He could feel the warmth of her body seeping through the layers of wool. It was a magnetic pull. Slowly, the shivering stopped. They lay in silence for a long time, listening to the wind. "It feels like the end of the world out there," Clara said softly. "It is just weather," Lucas replied. "The land tries to kill you. If you survive, it lets you stay a while longer." "Do you love it?" she asked. "This place?" Lucas thought about the drought, the blizzards, the grave on the hill. "I hate it," he said, "and I cannot imagine being anywhere else. It is honest. It does not lie to you like people do." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't lie." Under the covers, Clara shifted. Her hand moved, seeking warmth, and brushed against his hand where it rested on his chest. The touch was electric. It jolted through Lucas like a spark from the fire. He froze. He should pull away. He should move his hand. He didn't. Instead, his fingers uncurled. Slowly, tentatively, he let his hand rest against hers. Her skin was soft. His was rough, calloused by work. Clara's fingers curled around his. She held on tight. Lucas turned his head on the pillow. In the faint red glow of the embers, he could see her face. She had turned toward him. Her eyes were open, watching him. The air between them changed. It grew heavy, charged with a sudden, overwhelming awareness. He could hear her breathing. He could smell the scent of her hair, wood smoke, and something sweet, like dried flowers. He shifted, turning his body toward her. He was still on top of the covers, a barrier of wool between them, but it felt paper thin. He brought his other hand up, his fingers hovering near her face. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His thumb grazed her skin. Clara's breath hitched. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his. "Lucas," she whispered. It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it broke something in him. The loneliness of 3 years rose up, a tidal wave of need. He wanted to pull the blankets away. He wanted to feel her skin against his. He wanted to bury himself in her warmth and forget the cold, the grief, the empty house. He leaned in, her lips parted. Their breath mingled, warm puffs in the freezing air. He was inches away. He could taste the salt on her skin. He closed his eyes, his body screaming for her. Then, the image of Sarah's face in the photograph flashed in his mind, the trust in her eyes. And the trust in Clara's eyes now. Trust that he would not be like the other men, that he would not take advantage of her weakness, her injury, her trapped situation. He was her protector, not her lover. If he crossed this line now, while she was helpless in his bed, he would be no better than Thomas Cole, with a groan of physical pain. Lucas pulled back. He rolled onto his back, staring blindly at the ceiling beams. He withdrew his hand from her face, though he left his other hand in hers. "Go to sleep, Clara," he said, his voice rough and strained. There was a long silence. He felt Clara stiffen slightly, a pang of rejection radiating from her. "Good night, Lucas," she whispered. Her voice sounded small, disappointed, but also relieved. She squeezed his hand once, then her breathing slowly evened out as sleep took her. Lucas lay awake for hours. He stared into the darkness, listening to the wind die down. He was warm for the first time in years, but his mind was a storm. He had let her in. He had let a stranger, a fallen woman, into his house, into his bed, into his grief. He had told her about Sarah. He had held her hand. He had wanted her. The solitude he had built around himself like a fortress had a crack in it now, a fissure wide enough for the light to get in. And as the first gray light of dawn crept across the ceiling, Lucas Ward realized with a terrified certainty that he did not want her to leave. He was scared of the town, scared of the memory of his wife, but he was more scared of the silence returning when she was gone. He closed his eyes, his hand still gripping hers, and finally let himself sleep. Dawn did not break so much as it bled slowly into existence. The light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters was the color of old iron, flat and cold. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. Lucas Ward opened the front door and was greeted by a wall of white. The drift had piled up waist-high against the porch, a sculpted wave frozen in the act of crashing. Beyond it, the world had been erased. The familiar landmarks, the fence line, the woodpile, the path to the barn, were softened into undulating mounds of snow. He stepped out, his boots sinking deep, the cold biting through his trousers instantly. He exhaled, and his breath formed a thick cloud that hung in the still air. It was a landscape of absolute purity and absolute indifference. The ranch was no longer connected to the earth. It was an island, adrift in a frozen sea, cut off from Dusty Creek, from the law, and from time itself. Inside the cabin, Clara woke to the sound of a shovel scraping against wood. She lay still for a moment, the memory of the previous days washing over her. The fever had receded, leaving her feeling hollowed out but clear-headed. Her leg throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a reminder of the jagged tear beneath the bandages. She pushed herself up on her elbows, looking down at herself. She was still wearing Lucas's gray flannel shirt, the cuffs swallowed by the blankets. The intimacy of it, wearing his clothes, sleeping in his bed while he slept on the floor or in a chair, sent a flush of heat up her neck. It was improper. In the eyes of the town, it was damning. But when she looked at the window, seeing the frost ferns choking the glass, she knew the town might as well be on the moon. The door opened, and Lucas stomped in, shaking snow from his coat. He brought the cold with him, a sharp, bracing scent of winter air and pine. He looked at her, his eyes checking her face for signs of the fever returning. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with morning disuse. "Good morning," Clara replied, pulling the quilt higher. "Is it? Can we leave?" Lucas hung his hat on the peg and turned to the stove to warm his hands. "Not today. The drifts are too deep for the horses, and I cannot get the wagon through until the wind scours some of this down or the sun melts a crust on top. We are snowed in." Clara nodded, a mix of anxiety and strange relief settling in her chest. "I am taking up your bed. I should move to the chair." "You will stay in the bed," Lucas said, his tone brokering no argument. "You are healing. I can sleep on the floor just fine. It is not the first time I have roughed it in my own house." He poured 2 cups of coffee, the black liquid steaming in the chilly room. He brought one to her. As he handed it over, their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that seemed to carry a spark. Lucas pulled his hand back quickly, turning away to check the fire. "I have to get to the barn," he said. "The stock will be thirsty. The troughs will be frozen solid." "Let me help," Clara said instinctively. Lucas looked at her leg, then at her face, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You can help by not tearing those stitches. Rest." The next 2 days passed in a rhythm that was quiet, domestic, and terrifyingly comfortable. The ranch demanded work, regardless of the weather. Lucas spent hours outside, battling the elements. From the window, Clara watched him. She saw him wading through the snow, carrying heavy bales of hay on his shoulders to the huddling cattle. She saw the rhythmic swing of the axe as he chopped ice from the water troughs, his breath puffing in white bursts like a steam engine. He worked with a relentless, punishing intensity, as if he were trying to exhaust the demons in his mind through sheer physical exertion. He was a man who did not know how to stop. He mended a section of the corral where the wind had torn a rail loose. He shoveled a path from the house to the barn and the wood pile. He checked the hooves of the horses. He was a force of nature, matching his strength against the indifference of the land. Clara, unable to sit idle while he worked himself to the bone, found her own ways to contribute. She found a makeshift crutch, a sturdy length of unparalleled wood Lucas had smoothed down for her, and hobbled around the main room. She washed the dishes, standing on one leg at the basin, scrubbing the tin plates until they shone. She found his mending pile, a basket of shirts with missing buttons and socks with holes in the heels, and set to work. Her hands, skilled from years of seamstress work, flew over the fabric. She darned the socks with the neat, invisible stitches. She reattached buttons. She even took a broom and swept the floor from the edge of the bed when her leg grew too tired to stand. When Lucas came in at midday, his face red from the wind and his eyebrows frosted with ice, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at the clean table, the swept hearth, the stack of mended clothes folded neatly on the chair. He looked at Clara, who was sitting by the fire, peeling potatoes for a stew. "You did not have to do that," he said, nodding toward the clothes. "You saved my life." "Lucas," she said without looking up, the knife moving steadily. "Fixing a few buttons seems a poor trade, but it is what I have." He did not answer, but later, when he put on one of the mended shirts, she saw him run his thumb over the stitching, a thoughtful expression on his face. The silence of the high plains was a living presence. It was not an empty silence. It was vast. When the wind died down, the stillness was so complete that the snap of a burning log sounded like a gunshot. Clara learned the sounds of the house, the groan of the roof beams as the temperature dropped, the scratch of a mouse in the wall, the hiss of the kettle. Outside, the landscape was painted in shades of white and gray. The fields were blank pages. The tree line by the creek was a smudge of charcoal against a sky so pale it was almost translucent. Occasionally, the long, wavering cry of a coyote would drift down from the hills, a lonely, hungry sound that made Clara shiver and pull her shawl tighter. "They are close," she said one evening as the howling rose again. "They are hungry," Lucas said, looking up from the harness he was oiling by the fire. "Winter makes everyone bold, but they will not come near the house. They know the smell of a gun." "It sounds lonely," she said. "It is," Lucas replied. "But they have the pack. A coyote alone is a dead coyote. They sing to keep together." He looked at her then, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. People are not so different. The evenings became their sanctuary. The simple meals, beef stew with dumplings, cornbread, beans with salt pork, tasted better than anything Clara had eaten in the finest dining room in the territory. They sat at the small table, the lamp burning between them, the darkness pressed against the windows. The conversation, at first halting and practical, began to flow like a thawing creek. They talked of safe things first: horses, the weather, the price of feed. But slowly, the walls came down. "I grew up in Ohio," Lucas said one night, staring into his coffee cup. "Green everywhere, trees so thick you could not see the sky. I thought I would suffocate." "I would like to see trees like that," Clara mused. "I grew up in Kansas, just grass and wind. My father used to say the wind would blow your sins away if you stood in it long enough." She smiled a little, a sad, crooked thing. "I must not have stood in it long enough." Lucas chuckled, a low, rusty sound that surprised them both. "I think you have stood in enough wind for 3 lifetimes. Clara." She told him about the first time she saw the mountains, how they had frightened her with their size. He told her about a pony he had when he was 6 that bit everyone but him. They shared small jokes, the kind that rise from shared exhaustion and comfort. Clara found herself watching him more and more. She watched the way his large hands handled delicate things, the way he poured the coffee, the way he adjusted the wick of the lamp. She saw the tension that lived in his shoulders, a permanent knot of responsibility. And she noticed where he looked when he thought she was not watching. Every morning, before he started his work, he would stand on the porch and look toward a low hill to the east, where a single oak tree stood against the skyline. It was the place where the villagers said his wife had been found. His face would harden, a mask of grief sliding into place, before he turned and attacked the day's work with renewed fury. One afternoon, while Lucas was out checking the fence line on the ridge, Clara explored the cabin. She moved slowly on her crutch, touching the edges of his life. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books on the rough pine shelf. There were only 4. A heavy family Bible with a cracked leather spine, a farmer's almanac, a book of veterinary medicine, and a worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans. She opened the novel and saw an inscription on the flyleaf. "To Lucas. So you remember there is adventure in the world." "Sarah." She closed the book quickly, feeling like an intruder. She looked at the kitchen. Everything was meticulously organized. The tins were lined up by size. The skillet hung on its specific nail. It was the order of a man who could not control the world outside, so he controlled the few inches of space he owned. It was a sterile, lonely order. There were no knickknacks, no softened edges, no signs of joy. Just survival. She realized then how deep the silence of his life went. He had not just lost a wife. He had lost the future he was building. He was simply marking time, waiting for the land to claim him too, and yet he had brought her here. He had saved her. He had filled the house with the smell of cooking and the sound of a voice other than his own. When Lucas returned that evening, the air in the cabin felt different, charged. He stood by the door, unbuttoning his heavy coat. His fingers were stiff with cold and fumbled with the top button. "Here," Clara said, stepping forward. "Let me." She reached up. Lucas went still. She undid the button, her knuckles brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She took the coat from his shoulders and hung it on the peg. When she turned back, he was watching her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He reached out, almost involuntarily, and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a second on her cheek, rough skin against soft. "You look better," he said, his voice low. The color is back in your face. I feel better, she whispered. He pulled his hand back, clearing his throat. Supper will not cook itself. But the moment hung between them, shimmering in the air. When he passed her a cup of water later, their fingers touched and held for a beat too long. When their eyes met across the fire, neither looked away as quickly as they should have. It came to a head the next night. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters, but inside, the fire was roaring. They were sitting on the rug before the hearth, the warmth soaking into their bones. Lucas was whittling a piece of cedar, the shavings curling onto the floor. Clara was mending a tear in her own dress, which had dried stiff and ruined, but she was trying to salvage it. "Lucas," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. He looked up, the knife pausing. "Yeah, I want to thank you," she said. "Not for the rescue. I mean, yes, for that, but for the other thing. For believing me about Thomas Cole." Lucas set the wood down. "The truth is the truth. Clara, it does not need my belief to make it real." "It does to me," she said fiercely. "You do not know what it is like to scream the truth until your throat bleeds and have everyone look at you like you are speaking a foreign language. I started to think maybe they were right. Maybe I did something. Maybe I smiled wrong. Maybe I deserved it." Lucas's expression darkened. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You listen to me. Men like Cole and his son, they rely on that. They rely on shame. They want you to think it is your fault, so you stay quiet. It is a coward's weapon." His voice was a low rumble of anger, protective and hard. "You did nothing to earn that. Clara, nothing." Clara felt a tightness in her chest, a painful swelling of emotion. She had been discarded, spat upon, and used. And here was this man, this hard, quiet rancher, defending her honor as if it were a precious thing. She looked at him, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes, the strength of his hands, the weary curve of his mouth. She felt a pull toward him that was terrifying in its strength. It was not just gratitude. It was a hunger to be close to the one person who saw her. She set her sewing aside. She shifted closer to him on the rug. Lucas watched her, his eyes widening slightly. He did not move away. "Clara?" he murmured. She did not answer. She leaned in, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to take something for herself, just for once. She wanted to feel something other than cold and shame. She closed the distance and pressed her lips to his. It was tentative at first, a question asked in the silence. Lucas went rigid, his breath catching. For a second, he did not respond. Then, with a low groan that seemed to come from the center of his chest, he surrendered. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. He kissed her back, and the tentativeness vanished, replaced by a raw, starving hunger. It was a kiss of two people who had been alone for a lifetime. It was desperate and deep, tasting of coffee and longing. Clara pressed herself against him, her hands tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She felt the roughness of his unshaven face, the solid wall of his chest. Lucas shifted, pulling her closer, his self-control trembling on the edge of breaking. His hand slid down her back, pressing her to him. The heat between them flared, sudden and consuming. Then, just as suddenly, Lucas broke the kiss. He pulled back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and dark. He gripped her shoulders, putting a few inches of space between them. "Clara!" he gasped. "Wait!" Clara stared at him, her lips swollen, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Why?" "I cannot," he said, his voice ragged. You are hurt. You are here because you have nowhere else to go. I will not be another man who takes what he wants just because you are vulnerable." Clara shook her head, confusion and hurt warring in her face. "You think I feel obliged? You think this is payment?" "I think you are in a bad spot," Lucas said, his jaw tight. "And I'm a man with too much darkness in him to take advantage of that." Clara reached out, grabbing his shirt front, pulling him slightly. "I am not paying you. Lucas, I wanted this. I am tired of men taking from me. Yes, but I am not tired of wanting." She looked him dead in the eye. "I am choosing you. Can you not see that?" Lucas looked at her, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. He saw only fire and need. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "Clara, kiss me," she whispered. "Please." He kissed her again, slower this time. His hands moved over her back, trembling with the effort of restraint. He kissed her throat, the pulse point of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. But he did not take it further. When she tried to pull him down onto the rug, he resisted, gentle but firm. "No," he whispered against her hair. "Not like this. Not while you are healing. Not while the world is locked out." "Lucas," she pleaded softly. "I will not do it," he said, pulling back and looking at her with a fierce, sad resolve. "You deserve better than a quick tumble in the dark with a man who cannot even offer you a clear name. I will not add my name to the list of men who used you." Clara slumped back, frustration and a strange, aching tenderness filling her. He was stopping because he respected her. It was a foreign concept. "You are a stubborn man, Lucas Ward," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I have been told," he said. He reached out and squeezed her hand, his grip tight. "Go to sleep, Clara, before I lose the little sense I have left." They slept in the bed again that night. Clara under the covers, Lucas on top. But this time, he held her. His arm was draped over her waist, holding her anchored tight against him. They did not speak, but the air between them was electric, heavy with what had happened and what had been held back. The morning brought a brilliant, blinding sun. The sky was a hard, polished blue. The temperature had risen overnight, and the sound of dripping water echoed from the eaves. The snow had settled, shrinking down from the waist-high drifts to a wet, heavy blanket that a horse could push through. Lucas stood at the window, drinking coffee. He looked at the road. "I can get the wagon to town today," he said without turning around. Clara, sitting up in bed, felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. The bubble was bursting. The world was coming back. "Today?" she asked. "Your leg needs a doctor," Lucas said. "My stitching held, but I am not a surgeon, and you need rest that is not on a lumpy mattress in a drafty cabin." "I see," Clara said quietly. There was an awkward heaviness in the room as they packed. The easy domesticity of the last few days was gone, replaced by the looming reality of Dusty Creek. They moved around each other carefully, both remembering the heat of the kiss, the feel of skin on skin, and the words spoken in the firelight. Lucas hitched up the wagon, a small buckboard that had seen better days. He filled the bed with hay and blankets to cushion the ride. He came inside to help her. Clara had put her ruined dress back on, but it was torn and blood-stained. It offered no warmth. "Wear this," Lucas said, handing her his heavy buffalo coat and a clean flannel shirt. "And take the blanket. I will look like a scarecrow." She tried to joke, but her voice was brittle. "You will look warm," he said. He helped her out to the wagon. He lifted her easily, his hands strong and sure on her waist. For a second, as he held her, he looked into her eyes. There was a question there, a longing. But he blinked it away and set her gently onto the seat. The ride into town was slow and silent. The horses labored through the slush and mud. The landscape was emerging from the snow like a drowned thing. The pristine white was gone, replaced by the brown and gray of the earth. Fences were broken, rails sticking up like jagged teeth. Dead brush, black and rot-wet, was scattered across the trail. "The drought killed the roots," Lucas said, pointing to a wash where the earth had collapsed. "The snow covers it, but the land is hurt." "It will grow back," Clara said. "Maybe," Lucas said. "Or maybe it just washes away." They rounded the final bend, and Dusty Creek lay before them. It looked small and dirty against the vastness of the plains. Smoke rose from the chimneys. As the wagon rattled down the main street, heads turned. The town was digging itself out. Men were shoveling boardwalks. Women were sweeping slush from stoops. They stopped. They looked. They saw Lucas Ward, the recluse widower, and sitting beside him, wrapped in his coat, wearing his clothes, was Clara Hale. The silence that fell over the street was louder than the storm had been. Clara felt her chin lift automatically, a defense mechanism honed by months of abuse. But inside, she was shrinking. She saw Mrs. Miller stop mid-sweep, her mouth pursing into a tight line of disapproval. She saw the men in front of the saloon nudge each other and smirk. Lucas stared straight ahead, his face a mask of granite. He did not look left or right. He drove the wagon straight to the doctor's house at the end of the street. He pulled the horses to a halt and jumped down. He walked around to Clara's side and reached up to help her down. As she slid into his arms, her leg giving way, she heard a voice from the boardwalk, loud enough to carry, quiet enough to be a whisper. "Well, look at that. Looks like Clara found herself a warm bed for the blizzard after all. Moved on from the coal boy quick enough, didn't she? Reckon the widower gets lonely too." A ripple of laughter followed. Clara felt the heat rise up her neck, burning her skin. It was not just shame. It was a hot, sick anger, and beneath it, a new, terrible fear. She looked at Lucas. He had frozen, his hands still gripping her waist. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the men who had spoken. She had survived the storm. She had survived the cold. But now, she realized, she had dragged Lucas Ward into the mud with her. She had taken his quiet, dignified suffering and turned it into a tawdry joke for the town to chew on. "Lucas," she whispered urgently, clutching his arm. "Don't, please! Just get me inside!" Lucas looked down at her. The violence in his eyes terrified her, but he took a deep breath, his jaw grinding, and turned his back on the town. "Let's go," he said, his voice sounding like gravel. He helped her up the steps to the doctor's door, but the damage was done. The whispers were already turning into a roar in Clara's mind, and she knew, with a sinking heart, that the storm inside the cabin had been the easy part. The real storm was just beginning. The rumors did not walk through Dusty Creek. They ran. They moved faster than the wind that scoured the main street, slipping under doors and through the cracks in window frames until the entire town was breathing the same poisoned air. It had only been 3 days since Lucas Ward brought Clara Hale back from the snowbound isolation of his ranch. But in that short time, the story of a rescue had been butchered into a fable of scandal. The truth, that a man had saved a dying woman from freezing, was too simple, too decent for a town hungry for distraction. Instead, the story became that Clara had finally ensnared a widower, that she had feigned injury to get into his bed, and that Lucas Ward, the man who walked with the ghost of his saintly wife, had finally shown his true, base nature. Lucas felt the change the moment he rode into town on Thursday. It was subtle at first, a sudden silence when he entered the livery stable, the way men looked at their boots rather than meeting his eyes. But by the time he reached the general store, the hostility was open. He placed his order on the counter. A sack of flour, coffee, fencing staples. Silas, the storekeeper who had known Lucas for 10 years, did not ask about the ranch. He did not ask about the weather. He weighed the flour in silence, his movements jerky and nervous. "That will be $4, Silas said, looking somewhere over Lucas's left shoulder. Lucas placed the coins on the wood. "Is there a problem, Silas?" The older man flinched. He glanced toward the back of the store where 2 other men were pretending to inspect a harness. "No problem. Lucas, just busy. You know how it is." Lucas knew exactly how it was. He took his supplies and walked out, his back stiff. The real blow came an hour later at the stockyards. Lucas had arranged to meet a cattle buyer from Wyoming, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had expressed interest in 20 head of Lucas's steers. It was a sale Lucas desperately needed. The banknote was coming due, and the drought had thinned his reserves. Henderson was there, leaning against the rail, smoking a cigar. But as Lucas approached, the man's face closed up like a fist. "Mr. Ward," Henderson said, tipping his hat but making no move to shake hands. "Mr. Henderson," Lucas replied. "The steers are in the south pen. Did you get a look?" "I did," the buyer said. He took a long drag on his cigar and exhaled a plume of blue smoke. "I am afraid I will have to pass. Lucas." Lucas frowned. "Pass? You said they were the best-looking stock you had seen this side of the pass last month. They are healthy. They are fed." "It is not the weight," Henderson said, shifting his feet. "It is the market. Uncertain times. I cannot take the risk on a small herd right now." "The market has not changed in 3 days," Lucas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "What is this really about?" "Henderson." The buyer looked around, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, Lucas, I do business with Ephraim Cole. Big business, 500 head a season. Cole. He let it be known that he would take it unkindly if his partners did business with men of poor character." Lucas felt the blood heat in his veins. "Poor character?" Henderson shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "You know what they are saying. The woman, the Hale girl. Cole says you are unstable, says you are thinking with your trousers and letting your ranch go to rot. He says any man who brings a whore into his wife's bed is not a man to be trusted with a contract." Lucas stepped forward, his hand twitching toward the buyer's collar, but he stopped himself. Violence would only prove Cole right. "Ephraim Cole is a liar," Lucas said through gritted teeth. "And you are a fool if you listen to him." "Maybe," Henderson said, backing away. "But he is a rich liar. And you are just a man with a mortgage and a scandal. I'm sorry. Lucas." Lucas watched the man walk away. He stood alone in the mud of the stockyard, the wind tearing at his coat, feeling the walls closing in. Clara saw the damage before Lucas did. She saw it in the way Mrs. Miller crossed the street to avoid walking near her. She heard it in the whispers that followed her when she went to the well. "There she goes. The spider." Caught herself a fly. She had moved back into her tiny room behind the saloon, desperate to put distance between herself and Lucas, desperate to stop the bleeding of his reputation. But the stain was already spreading. She sat on the edge of her cot, her hands trembling as she tried to thread a needle. She had refused Lucas's offer of firewood. She had refused the food he tried to send. She told herself she was doing it for him. She told herself that if she cut him out like a canker, he might heal. But the memory of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, the weight of his hand in hers, the taste of that single, desperate kiss, haunted her. It made the cold of her room feel absolute. That evening, Lucas found her. She had gone out the back way to empty her wash basin in the alley behind the saloon. It was a narrow, dark strip of earth that smelled of dust, spilled whiskey, and old garbage. A wooden sign creaked overhead, swinging in the restless wind. "Clara!" She froze. She knew that voice better than she knew her own heartbeat now. She turned slowly. Lucas stood at the mouth of the alley, a silhouette against the fading light of the street. He looked exhausted. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "You have been avoiding me," he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "I have been busy," Clara said, clutching the empty basin to her chest. "I have work to do, Lucas, and so do you." He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I went to your door. You did not answer. I sent a boy with wood. You sent him back. I do not need your charity," she said, making her voice hard. "I managed before the storm. I will manage now." "It is not charity," Lucas snapped, his calm facade cracking. "Damn it, Clara, after everything, after that night, you act as if we are strangers, as if I am just another customer you are trying to shake off." The words hit her like a slap. She flinched, but she stood her ground. She saw the pain in his eyes, the confusion of a man who had opened his fortress and had the door slammed in his face. "We are strangers." "Lucas," she lied. The words tasted like bile. "You found me in the snow. You warmed me up. That is all it was. Do not make it into a fairy tale." "It was more than that," Lucas said, stepping into her space. He towered over her, smelling of horses and anger. "I know what I felt. I know what you felt when you kissed me." "I kissed you because I was scared," Clara cried out, stepping back until her shoulders hit the rough wood of the saloon wall. I kissed you because the wind was howling and I did not want to be alone. It is what I do. Lucas, I am a survivor. I use what I have. I used you to feel safe for a night. That is all." She saw him recoil. She saw the light in his eyes die, replaced by a cold, shuttered look. It broke her heart to do it, but she had to make him hate her. If he hated her, he would stay away. If he stayed away, Cole might leave him alone. "Is that the truth?" Lucas asked, his voice deadly quiet. "You are telling me that night meant nothing? That you are exactly what this town says you are?" "Yes," Clara hissed, tears threatening to spill, which she fought back with sheer will. "I am exactly what they say. You are a fool for risking your ranch for someone like me. Go home to your ghost. Lucas, leave me to the gutter where I belong." Lucas looked at her for a long moment, the silence stretched tight, humming with the noise of the saloon on the other side of the wall. Laughter, piano music, the sounds of a world that didn't care about them. "Fine," Lucas said, "if that is how you want it." He turned on his heel and walked away. He did not look back. Clara waited until his footsteps faded completely. Then she slid down the wall to the dirt, buried her face in her apron, and wept until her throat felt raw. Ephraim Cole sat on the veranda of his sprawling ranch house, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was a heavy-set man with a face like a bulldog, jowls that hung heavy and eyes that missed nothing. He watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. "So," Cole rumbled to his son, Thomas, who was leaning against the porch rail, "the Ward fellow lost the contract with Henderson." Thomas laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Henderson barely looked at the cows. He was too busy looking over his shoulder for you." "Good," Cole said. He took a sip of brandy. "Ward sits on the best water in the valley. That creek of his runs deep even when the sky is dry. I have offered to buy him out 3 times. He is stubborn. He thinks he can hold on to the past, and now he has the whore." Thomas sneered. "Playing house with her, that," Cole said, swirling the amber liquid, "is our lever. A man alone is hard to break. A man distracted. A man trying to save a drowning woman. He makes mistakes. He gets desperate." Cole set the glass down. "We need to make sure he understands his position. Rumors are good, Thomas, but accidents are better. The bank needs to see that Ward is a bad investment, and Ward needs to see that keeping that woman will cost him everything." The campaign began the next night. It started small. Lucas woke to the sound of lowing cattle. He rode out at dawn to find a section of fencing on the North Ridge cut, not broken by wind, but cut clean with wire cutters. 20 head of cattle had wandered off into the Badlands. It took him 2 days of back-breaking riding to find them and drive them back. 3 days later, he found the watering hole in the lower pasture fouled. Someone had dragged the carcass of a coyote and a dead calf into the water. The smell of rot hung heavy in the air. The cattle would not drink it. Lucas spent the day hauling buckets from the creek, his muscles screaming, his anger burning hotter with every hour. Then came the nights. Shots fired in the dark, close to the house, echoing off the barn walls. Just enough to spook the horses, to keep him awake, to fray his nerves to the breaking point. He knew it was Cole. He knew it in his gut. But the sheriff merely shrugged when Lucas reported the cut fence. "Wind does strange things, Ward, and maybe your cows are just thirsty. Can't prove a man cut a wire unless you see him do it." The land seemed to join the conspiracy. An early spring drought tightened its grip. The wind blew relentlessly, drying the soil to powder. A storm tore the shingles off the barn roof. Lucas felt like he was fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the malice of men and the indifference of nature. He grew thinner. The circles under his eyes deepened. But he did not go back to town. He did not go to Clara. He worked, and he waited, and he hated. Clara watched from a distance. She heard the talk in the saloon, drunken ranch hands boasting about spooking the widower and teaching him a lesson. She realized her sacrifice had been in vain. Leaving Lucas hadn't protected him. It had only left him to face the wolves alone. One afternoon, Clara was walking along the ridge above town, gathering sagebrush for kindling. It was a habit she had formed to get out of the suffocating air of her room. From the high ground, she could see the valley spread out below. She saw a wagon moving along the old logging road that bordered Lucas's property. It was not a road anyone used. It was overgrown and rough. Clara crouched behind a boulder, watching. The wagon stopped near a dense thicket of dry scrub oak, dangerously close to Lucas's grazing land. Two men jumped down. Even at this distance, she recognized the shape of their hats. They were Cole's riders. They began unloading barrels from the wagon bed. They rolled them into the brush, hiding them under branches and dead leaves. Clara squinted. The barrels were dark, heavy. They weren't feed, they weren't water, oil, or kerosene. Her blood ran cold. The grass was tinder dry. The wind was blowing straight toward Lucas's ranch house. If they lit a fire there, with accelerant to push it, it wouldn't just be a brush fire. It would be an inferno. It would wipe him out. She scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to tell him. She looked at the sun. It was already touching the western hills. Dusk was coming. She didn't have a horse. She would have to walk. It was 5 miles to the Ward Ranch. Clara didn't hesitate. She gathered her skirts and began to run. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and angry red, when Clara stumbled up the lane to Lucas's house. Her lungs were burning, her leg throbbing with every step. But she didn't stop until she reached the porch. Lucas was there, repairing a harness by the last light of the day. He looked up, his hand dropping to the Colt revolver on his hip before he recognized her. "Clara." He stood up slowly. He looked wrecked. His shirt was stained with sweat and dirt, his face gaunt. But when he saw her, the hardness in his eyes wavered. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rasping. "Cole's men." Clara gasped, leaning against the porch rail to catch her breath. "I saw them, on the logging road. They hid barrels in the brush. Oil barrels. Lucas, they're going to burn you out." Lucas went still. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp, lethal focus. "Where?" "The North Ridge, near the scrub oak." Lucas swore softly. He looked at the sky. The wind was picking up, blowing from the north. "If they light it tonight, the wind will bring it right to the barn." He looked at her, and the focus shifted. The anger returned, but it was complicated now. "Why did you come? You said you wanted no part of this. You said I was just a customer." "I lied," Clara shouted, the exhaustion and fear finally snapping her control. "I lied, you stubborn fool. I saw them cutting you down. I saw the town spitting on you because of me, and I thought if I left, they would stop. I was trying to save you. I do not need saving by lies," Lucas shouted back. Stepping off the porch, they stood in the dirt yard, the wind whipping their clothes. "You think I care what Henderson or Mrs. Miller thinks? You think I care about the contract?" "You should," Clara cried. "It is your life. It is your home. I have nothing. Lucas, I am used to having nothing. But you have this land. You have her memory. I will not be the thing that destroys it. You are not destroying it." Lucas grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard. "You are the only real thing that has happened to me in 3 years. Do you understand that? I was dead, Clara. I was walking around, doing the chores, breathing air. But I was dead. I was buried in that snow with Sarah until the night I brought you here." The confession hung between them, raw and terrified. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "Lucas." "I hated you in that alley," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "I tried to hate you, but every time they cut a fence, every time they poisoned the water, all I could think about was that I wished you were here to help me fight it. I would rather lose the ranch standing with you than keep it standing alone." Clara looked at his face, the dirt, the lines of pain, the fierce, burning life in his eyes. The wall she had built to protect him crumbled. The wall she had built to protect herself shattered. "I tried to stay away," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "It hurt. God, it hurt so much. I thought I was doing the right thing." "Stop doing the right thing," Lucas said roughly. And tell me what you want, not what you think is safe. What you want? Clara reached up, her hands finding the lapels of his coat. I want to not be alone. I want you. I want us to fight them. The distance between them vanished. Lucas pulled her in, his mouth finding hers with a desperation that erased the weeks of silence. It was not gentle. It was a collision of fear and need, a claiming. They stumbled backward, up the steps, through the door of the cabin. The room was dark, lit only by the glowing embers of the hearth. They broke apart only to tear at clothes, heavy coats, buttons, barriers. Lucas's hands were everywhere, rough and frantic, needing to touch skin to prove she was real, that she was there. Clara! He groaned against her neck. Clara! He lifted her, carrying her to the bed, the same bed where he had stitched her wound, the bed that had been a shrine to the dead. He laid her down, not with reverence this time, but with passion. He hovered over her, his breathing ragged. He paused, his hands framing her face. The frantic energy stilled for a second, replaced by a profound gravity. Are you sure? He asked. If we do this, there is no going back. The town will never let us forget it. I will never let you go. Clara looked up at him. She saw the scars on his soul, the fear that he would break everything he touched. She reached up and pulled him down. I am choosing, she whispered. I choose this. I choose you. Don't stop. The phrase echoed from that first night, but the meaning had changed entirely. It was no longer a plea for survival. It was a demand for life. Lucas kissed her, and the last resistance in him broke. The night was a fever. It was a release of 3 years of grief for him, and a lifetime of shame for her. They moved together with a clumsy, beautiful urgency. There was no room for ghosts in the bed anymore. There was only the heat of their skin, the sound of their breath, the desperate clinging of two people who had found a raft in the middle of the ocean. They memorized each other in the dark. The curve of a shoulder, the roughness of a scar, the sound of a name whispered like a prayer. It was an act of defiance against the town, against Cole, against the impending fire. It was a declaration that they were alive, and they were together. Morning came too soon, and it came with the smell of smoke. Lucas woke with a start. The light coming through the window was wrong. It was orange, not gray. The air in the cabin was hazy. He sat up, his heart pounding. Clara woke beside him, sensing his tension. She sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, her hair wild around her face. Lucas? Fire, he said. He was out of bed in a second, pulling on his trousers and boots. He grabbed his shirt, not bothering to button it fully. Clara scrambled up, finding her dress, her movements sharp with panic. They ran out onto the porch. The horizon to the north was gone. In its place was a wall of black smoke, billowing up into the sky. Beneath it, a line of angry orange flames licked at the belly of the clouds. The wind was driving it hard, straight toward the grazing land where Lucas's herd was clustered. The barrels, Clara said, horror in her voice. They lit them. Get the horses, Lucas ordered, his voice calm with the terrible clarity of emergency. Grab the wet sacks. We have to turn the herd before it reaches the canyon. They rode out into a nightmare. The heat hit them a mile before the fire did. It was a physical weight, pressing against their skin. The sound was a roar, like a freight train tearing through the brush. When they reached the ridge, they saw the extent of it. The dry scrub oak was exploding in the heat. The fire was moving fast, devouring the grass, leaving nothing but black ash in its wake. "Yeah!" Lucas screamed, driving his horse toward the terrified cattle. Clara rode beside him, her fear forgotten in the adrenaline of the moment. They shouted and whistled, driving the cows away from the smoke, pushing them toward the rocky creek bed where the fire couldn't follow. Neighbors began to arrive. Men from the adjoining ranches who had seen the smoke. Even the ones who had shunned Lucas in town came. In the West, fire was the common enemy. You fought it, no matter whose land it was, because next time it could be yours. They fought the fire for hours. They beat at the flames with wet burlap sacks. They dug trenches. They choked on smoke until they were spitting black phlegm. Clara worked alongside the men, her face soot-stained, her dress singed, refusing to stop even when her legs trembled with exhaustion. She saw a barrel, split open and blackened, rolling in the heart of the flames. The proof. By noon, the wind shifted. The fire turned back on itself and began to die. Starved of fuel. The danger to the house was past. The herd was safe, but the damage was catastrophic. Lucas sat on his horse, looking out over the north pasture. It was a moonscape. Hundreds of acres of grazing land were gone, turned to scorched earth. Without that grass, he could not feed the herd through the summer. He wiped sweat and soot from his forehead, his hand leaving a smear of gray. A buggy approached through the haze. The black paint shone, untouched by the ash. Ephraim Cole sat on the bench seat, holding the reins. Thomas sat beside him. Lucas watched them come. He did not move. Clara rode up beside him, her horse touching his. Cole pulled the buggy to a halt. He looked at the blackened land, then at Lucas. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his nose. "Terrible tragedy. Ward," Cole said. His voice was smooth, heavy with false sympathy. "Terrible bit of luck. First the drought, now this. Luck had nothing to do with it," Lucas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried over the hiss of the dying fire. Cole ignored him. "I imagine this puts you in a tight spot. No grass, banknote due. It would be a shame to see you lose everything to the foreclosure." Cole smiled, a shark-like baring of teeth. "I am a generous man. Lucas, I will make the offer one last time. I will buy the deed, the land, the water rights. I will even give you enough to get a fresh start somewhere else. Somewhere less complicated." He glanced at Clara, his eyes lingering on her with cold amusement. "Take the girl and go. Ward, before the whole world burns down around you." Lucas looked at the scorched earth. He looked at the barrel smoldering in the distance. He looked at Clara, sitting tall and fierce beside him, soot on her face and steel in her spine. He looked back at Cole. "Get off my land," Lucas said. Cole's smile vanished. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Lucas said. He rested his hand on the horn of his saddle, inches from his gun. "This land is not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow. Not when it is green, and not when it is black." "You are making a mistake," Cole said, his voice dropping to a growl. "You cannot feed those cows on ash, boy. You are finished." "Get off my land," Lucas repeated, "or I will finish you right here." Cole stared at him, measuring the threat. He saw the look in Lucas's eyes, a look that said he had nothing left to lose but the woman beside him and the dirt beneath his feet. And he saw that the neighbors, leaning on their shovels, were watching. Cole snapped the reins. "Have it your way, Ward, but winter is coming, and it is going to be a long, cold one." The buggy turned and rattled away through the smoke. Lucas watched him go. Then he reached out and took Clara's hand. His grip was crushing. "He is right," Clara whispered, looking at the devastation. "How do we survive this?" "I don't know," Lucas said, looking at her. "But we are not running. We stay, and we fight." The silent war was no longer silent. It was open. And as the smoke cleared, revealing the scars on the land, Lucas knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The smell of ash did not leave. It clung to the air, settled in the water troughs, and coated the back of the throat with a gritty, bitter taste. 3 days after the fire, the Ward Ranch felt less like a home and more like a graveyard for hope. Lucas Ward stood by the corral fence, looking out at the charred devastation of his north pasture. The fire had taken more than just grass. It had taken the future. The 200 head of cattle he had managed to save were now crowded into the south lot, lowing with hunger, ribs beginning to show through their dusty hides. The drought had already turned the earth to iron, and now, without the grazing land, he had no way to feed them through the coming months. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble and the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones. The bank manager, Mr. Thornton, had ridden out yesterday, sitting stiffly in his buggy, eyes scanning the blackened earth. He had spoken of risk and collateral and the unfortunate necessity of calling in the loan early if Lucas could not prove solvency. It was a polite way of saying the vultures were circling. In town, the atmosphere was even more poisonous. Ephraim Cole was not resting on his victory. He held court in the barber shop in the hotel lobby, his voice booming with false concern. He painted a picture of Lucas as a man unhinged by grief and lust, a man whose recklessness had nearly burned down the valley. "It is a tragedy," Cole would say, shaking his heavy head. "But when a man brings that kind of trouble into his house, the Hale woman, chaos follows. It is unsafe for the community. If I held the water rights on that creek, I could ensure the safety of the lower farms. Ward is too unpredictable." People listened. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Cole offered stability, however brutal. The glances directed at Lucas and Clara were no longer just judgmental. They were fearful. Clara felt the weight of it every time she went to the well or hung laundry on the line. She saw the way the hired hands watched the horizon, expecting another disaster. But she refused to hide. She had gone into Dusty Creek that afternoon under the pretense of delivering a final batch of mending to the parson's wife, one of the few women who still spoke to her, mostly out of Christian duty. After the delivery, she had slipped into the back entrance of the saloon to collect a small debt owed to her by the piano player for a shirt she had fixed. The hallway was dim, smelling of stale beer and sawdust. As she passed the door to the private poker room, she heard a voice that made her blood turn to ice. "He is breaking. Father, I saw him at the fence line. He looks like a ghost." It was Thomas Cole. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Looking like a ghost and being a ghost are two different things. Ephraim Cole's deep voice rumbled through the wood. "Ward is stubborn. He turned down the offer again." "So we burn the rest?" Thomas asked, a casual cruelty in his tone. "No," Ephraim replied. "Fire is too messy now. The sheriff is sniffing around, useless as he is. We need to finish what we started with the girl. If she disappears, or if an accident befalls her, Ward will snap completely. He will either leave or do something that gives the law reason to hang him. I would like another crack at her before she goes." Thomas laughed, the sound wet and ugly. "She owes me for the trouble." "Focus, boy," Ephraim snapped. "Tonight, we celebrate the new contract with the railroad. Tomorrow, we plan the end of Lucas Ward. The ledgers are already updated to show the acquisition. I want that land by the first frost." Clara clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. She waited until the laughter resumed, then turned and fled, slipping out the back door into the blinding afternoon sun. She did not stop moving until she reached the ranch. Lucas was in the barn, trying to salvage a scorched piece of harness leather, when Clara burst in. She was breathless, her face pale beneath the brim of her bonnet. "Lucas!" she gasped. He dropped the leather and crossed the distance in 2 strides, gripping her shoulders. "What is it? Did someone touch you?" "I heard them," she said, words tumbling out. "In the saloon. Cole and Thomas. They are not stopping. Lucas, they are planning something else. They talked about an accident for me, to make you break." Lucas went still. The exhaustion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying rage. "He threatened you?" "He said if I was gone, you would have nothing left to lose," Clara said. "He wants the land. Lucas, he has already written it into his books. He is so sure he will win." Lucas released her and walked to the barn door, staring out at the dying light. "He is right," he said quietly. Clara stared at his back. "What?" "He is right," Lucas repeated, turning to face her. "I cannot protect you here. Clara, I thought I could. I thought if I stood my ground, the law or the town would step in. But they won't. I am just a man watching his life burn down. And now I am dragging you into the fire with me." He took a step toward her, his expression pleading. "I am going to sell, not to Cole, to the bank. I will take whatever they give me, and I will put you on a stagecoach to San Francisco tomorrow. You will be safe there." "And you?" Clara demanded. her voice rising. "I will deal with Cole," Lucas said darkly. "In my own way." "No!" Clara shouted, stomping her foot in the dust. "You are giving up. You are letting him win." "I am trying to keep you alive." Lucas roared back, the sound echoing off the rafters. "Do you think I care about the dirt? Do you think I care about the cows? I care about you. Everyone I love dies on this land. Clara, Sarah died in the snow because I was not there. I will not watch you die in the ash because I was too proud to let go." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. Clara walked up to him, her eyes blazing. She grabbed the front of his shirt and shook him. "You listen to me, Lucas Ward. You did not kill your wife. The winter killed her. And Cole will not kill me unless we let him. If you send me away, you are not saving me. You are killing the only part of yourself that has come alive in 3 years." She softened her grip, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the heavy thud of his heart. "I am not Sarah. I am Clara. I survived the streets. I survived the scandal. And I survived the storm. I am not a glass doll for you to put on a shelf in San Francisco. I love you. Do you hear me? I love you." Lucas looked down at her, his face crumbling. The walls he had built around his grief shattered. "Clara," he choked out, "I love you. God help me. I love you more than I know how to say." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. They held each other fiercely, two survivors clinging together in the wreckage of their world. "Then fight for me," Clara whispered against his neck. "Do not send me away. Fight with me." Lucas pulled back, framing her face in his rough hands. "How? We have no proof. The sheriff will not listen to hearsay." Clara's eyes hardened. "Then we get proof." She told him about the conversation she had overheard, about the ledgers Cole kept. "He keeps everything in the office safe," she said. "When I worked there, I saw him writing in them. Bribes, threats, the sheriff's payoffs, and the letters from the lawyer in Denver about Thomas, about the night he hurt me." Lucas frowned. "That is in the house, in a locked room." Clara reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a heavy brass key ring. "When I was delivering the sewing today, I stopped by the livery. Cole's buggy was there. His jacket was on the seat. I recognized the key ring from when I worked at the house. I took it." Lucas stared at the keys, then at her. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "You stole Ephraim Cole's keys?" "I borrowed them," Clara said with a fierce grin. "I figure he owes me." Lucas looked out the window. The sky was turning a bruised purple. Heavy clouds were rolling in from the west, blotting out the stars. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and menacing. "There is a storm coming," Lucas said. "A bad one. It will cover the noise." "We can be there and back before dawn," Clara said. Lucas looked at her, seeing the steel in her spine. He nodded once. "Go get the horses." The ride to the Circle C ranch was a journey into the throat of the storm. The wind whipped across the plains, tearing at their coats and stinging their faces with grit. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the ground beneath the horses' hooves. They rode in silence, side by side. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional fork of lightning that illuminated the rolling hills in stark, skeletal relief. They tied the horses in a dry wash a half-mile from the main house. Cole's ranch was a sprawling compound of corrals, barns, and bunkhouses, dominated by the main house, a 2-story structure of white timber that looked like a palace compared to Lucas's cabin. They moved on foot, crouching low in the tall grass. The wind was their ally, masking the sound of their boots. The bunkhouse was dark, the hired hands likely asleep or in town spending their pay. They reached the back of the main house. Clara led the way to a small service door near the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she tried the keys. The third one fit. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed deafening to their heightened senses. They slipped inside. The house smelled of beeswax, expensive tobacco, and old money. The floorboards groaned softly under their weight, but the wind rattling the windows covered the noise. "The office is down the hall. To the left," Clara whispered. They moved like shadows. Lucas kept his hand near his gun, his eyes scanning every dark corner. They reached the heavy oak door of the office. It was locked. Clara tried the keys again. Click! They stepped inside, and Lucas closed the door softly behind them. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his cupped hand, and lit the kerosene lamp on the desk, turning the wick down until it threw only a dim, golden circle of light. The room was oppressive, filled with heavy furniture and the smell of Ephraim coal. On the wall hung the mounted head of a buffalo, its glass eyes staring blindly. "The safe!" Clara pointed to the corner. It was a heavy iron box. Lucas knelt before it. "Do you have a key for this?" "No," Clara said. "But the drawers, look in the desk." They rifled through the desk drawers. They found maps of the valley with Lucas's land circled in red ink. They found receipts for services rendered signed by the sheriff. "Here," Lucas whispered, pulling a thick leather-bound book from the bottom drawer. He opened it. It was a ledger of unparalleled detail. Cole was arrogant. He wrote down everything, believing himself untouchable. There were entries for fire crews on the dates of the barn burnings. There were payments to witnesses regarding the night of Clara's assault. And tucked into the back cover was a bundle of letters. Lucas unfolded one. It was from Thomas to his father, admitting to the assault and asking for help to cover it up. "This is it," Lucas said, his voice grim. "This hangs them both." "We have to go," Clara said, clutching a stack of papers. "We have enough?" Lucas blew out the lamp, just as the room plunged into darkness. The sound of hoofbeats erupted outside. Not one horse, many. Voices shouted over the wind. Laughter, drunken yelling. "They are back," Lucas hissed. "Early." The front door of the house slammed open. Heavy boots thudded on the hardwood floor of the entryway. "Get the whiskey. Thomas!" Cole's voice boomed. "And bring the ledgers. I want to show the boys the new map." Lucas and Clara froze. Steps were coming down the hall. "The window," Lucas whispered. He grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her toward the heavy velvet curtains. He threw the sash up. The wind howled into the room, sending papers flying from the desk. "Hey!" a voice shouted from the hallway. The office door burst open. Light from the hallway flooded in, catching Lucas and Clara framed in the window. It was Thomas Cole. He stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes widening in shock. "It's them!" Thomas screamed. "Pa! It's Ward!" Lucas didn't hesitate. He shoved Clara through the open window. She tumbled out, landing in a flower bed with a grunt of pain. Lucas vaulted after her. "Stop them!" Ephraim roared from inside. Gunshots shattered the night. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Lucas's head as he hit the ground. "Run!" Lucas yelled, grabbing Clara's arm. They sprinted across the yard toward the darkness of the open range. Behind them, the house erupted into chaos. Dogs barked, men shouted. More shots rang out, orange muzzle flashes blooming in the dark. They reached the wash where the horses were tied. Lucas threw Clara into her saddle. "Ride," he commanded. "Do not stop for anything." He swung onto his own horse. They tore out of the wash just as riders appeared on the ridge behind them. The chase was a nightmare of speed and darkness. The storm broke fully now. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the ground to slick mud. Lightning forked across the sky, blinding them one second and plunging them into pitch blackness the next. Bullets whizzed past like angry hornets. "Head for the canyon," Lucas shouted over the roar of the thunder. "We lose them in the rocks." They galloped hard, the horses blowing and stumbling on the uneven ground. They were gaining distance, the rain masking their tracks, when a crack of a rifle sounded closer than the others. Lucas felt a blow like a sledgehammer to his left shoulder. The impact nearly knocked him from the saddle. His arm went instantly numb, then exploded in white-hot agony. He gritted his teeth, a cry of pain dying in his throat. He slumped forward, gripping the saddle horn with his good hand. "Lucas!" Clara screamed, seeing him falter. "Keep going!" he gasped. He could feel the warm wetness of blood soaking his shirt, mixing with the cold rain. Darkness edged his vision. The world tilted. He swayed, dangerously close to falling. Clara saw it, She pulled her horse alongside his, risking a collision at full gallop. She reached out and grabbed his reins close to the bit. "Lean on me," she yelled. "Lean toward me." She guided their horses together, her leg pressing against his, her hand gripping his jacket to hold him upright. Her face was set in a mask of fierce, terrifying determination. She was not the seamstress now. She was a warrior fighting death for the man she loved. They plunged into the narrow mouth of the canyon. The rock walls rose up on either side, shielding them from the worst of the wind. The pursuit fell behind, the men wary of the treacherous terrain in the dark. They rode until the horses were trembling with exhaustion. Lucas was barely conscious, his head lolling. "There," Clara said, spotting a deep overhang of rock near the canyon wall. "Lucas, we have to stop." She pulled the horses to a halt under the shelter. It was dry there, a small pocket of safety in the deluge. Clara slid from her saddle and ran to Lucas. "Fall to me," she commanded. He slid down, his legs giving way. She caught him, staggering under his weight, and lowered him gently to the sandy ground. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cave. Lucas's left side was a mask of red. "The ledgers," Lucas rasped, clutching his coat. "Did we lose them?" "I have them," Clara said, her voice shaking as she tore at his shirt. "Forget the ledgers. Look at me." She exposed the wound. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the shoulder. It had missed the bone and the lung, but it was ugly and bleeding freely. "It went through," she said, relief making her dizzy. "It is clean." She tore a strip from her petticoat, the white cotton stark against the gloom. She folded it into a pad and pressed it hard against the wound. Lucas hissed, arching his back. "I know," she whispered, her tears finally mixing with the rain on her face. "I know. I have you." She bound the wound tight, using her own shawl as a sling to immobilize his arm. She worked with the same desperate care he had shown her that first night in the cabin. The roles had reversed. The circle closed. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, shivering. Lucas reached out with his good hand and touched her face. "You saved me," he whispered. "We are even," she said, leaning her forehead against his. They sat there in the dark, the storm raging inches away. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them cold and trembling. "If we get back," Lucas began. "When?" Clara corrected him. When we get back," Lucas said. "I am going to rebuild the barn, bigger this time, and I am going to plant a garden, for you, with flowers that do not die in the wind. And I will sing," Clara said softly, "on the porch. Not for money, just for us. Just for us." Lucas agreed. He pulled her down so her head rested on his good shoulder. The pain was a dull roar, but the warmth of her body against his was an anchor. "They will come for us in the morning," Clara said. "Let them come," Lucas said, his eyes closing. "We have the book. We have the truth. And I am not afraid anymore." They waited out the storm, huddled together in the dirt. When the dawn broke, it was gray and cold, but the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet sage and ozone. Clara helped Lucas to his horse. He was pale and weak, but he could ride. She mounted up beside him, the heavy ledger book tucked securely inside her cloak, against her heart. They rode out of the canyon and turned toward Dusty Creek. They did not look like victims. They looked like something forged in fire and quenched in storm. They rode side by side, bloody and battered, carrying the weapon that would bring an empire down. Everything depended on the next hour. Everything depended on whether the town would open its eyes or whether fear would win one last time. "Ready?" Lucas asked, his voice a rasp. Clara looked at him, her chin lifted high. "Don't stop," she said. "Never," he promised. They kicked their horses into a trot, riding toward the reckoning. The return to Dusty Creek was not a parade. It was a funeral march for the old order of things. The sun had barely crested the eastern hills, casting long, pale shadows across the mud of the main street. The town was waking up to the sound of hooves dragging through the slush, a slow, uneven rhythm that drew shopkeepers to their windows and early risers to the boardwalks. Clara Hale rode with her back straight, her face a mask of grim determination that looked carved from granite. Beside her, Lucas Ward was slumped forward in his saddle, his head lolling with the motion of the horse. His left arm was bound to his chest with a blood-soaked shawl, and his skin was the color of old parchment. He was conscious, but barely, his eyes half-lidded and glassy with pain. They looked like ghosts who had ridden out of hell. The mud on their clothes was mixed with ash from the fire and blood from the escape. A silence fell over the street as they passed. Mrs. Miller, sweeping her stoop, froze with her broom in midair. Silas, the storekeeper, stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron, his mouth falling open. Clara pulled her horse to a halt in front of the doctor's house. She did not wait for assistance. She slid from her saddle, her legs trembling from exhaustion, and landed hard in the mud. She ignored the pain in her own healing leg and ran to Lucas's horse, grabbing the bridle. "Doctor!" she screamed, her voice cracking like a whip through the morning air. "We need the doctor!" The sheer force of her command shattered the stupor of the town. Dr. Evans, a balding man with kind eyes and a weary demeanor, burst out of his front door, buttoning his suspenders. "Good Lord," Evans breathed, seeing the blood on Lucas's coat. "Help him down," Clara commanded, looking at the men gathering on the boardwalk. "Don't just stand there staring. Help him!" For a second, nobody moved. The hesitation was thick. Fear of Cole, fear of the scandal, fear of touching the pariahs. Then, Silas stepped off the boardwalk. "I've got him," the storekeeper said, his voice shaking but loud. Two other men, ranch hands who had helped fight the fire, followed suit. They eased Lucas out of the saddle. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony, as his boots touched the ground. His knees buckled, and the men caught him, carrying him up the steps like a fallen soldier. "Bring him to the surgery." "Doctor," Evans ordered, ushering them inside. Clara moved to follow, but she stopped at the threshold. She looked at Lucas's retreating form, seeing the dark trail of blood he left on the floorboards. She wanted nothing more than to be by his side, to hold his hand as he had held hers. But she knew that saving his life was only half the battle. If she went inside now, the poison in this town would fester. Ephraim Cole would spin his story. He would say Lucas attacked him. He would twist the truth until it strangled them. She turned back to the street. A crowd had gathered. 30 or 40 people stood in the mud, whispering, pointing, their faces a mixture of judgment and morbid curiosity. Clara reached into her cloak. Her hand closed around the thick, leather-bound ledger she had carried through the storm. It felt heavy, like a weapon. She walked down the steps and stood in the center of the street. She was small, dirty, and exhausted, but she vibrated with a rage so pure it terrified them. "Where is he?" she called out. She did not need to say the name. The crowd parted as a buggy rattled down the street from the direction of the hotel. Ephraim Cole sat on the bench, Thomas beside him. They looked fresh, clean, and arrogant. Cole pulled the horses up, looking down at Clara with a sneer of triumph. "Well," Cole rumbled, his voice carrying easily, "I see the sheriff finally did his job. Did you arrest Ward for trespassing and attempted murder?" "Sheriff?" The sheriff, a man named Brady, who had spent 10 years looking the other way, stepped out of the crowd. He looked at Cole, then at Clara. He looked unsure. "They just rode in Mr. Cole," the sheriff said. "Ward is shot." "Self-defense," Cole said smoothly. "They broke into my home. Thieves in the night. I warned you. Sheriff, I warned you all that Ward was unstable and that this woman was trouble." He looked at the crowd, spreading his hands. "It is a sad day when a man has to defend his own hearth from a neighbor, but justice must be done." "Liar," Clara shouted. Cole laughed, a dark, dismissive sound. "Go home, girl, before you say something that gets you hanged alongside him. No one here believes the word of a tainted woman." Clara held up the ledger. "They will believe this." Cole's face went slack. Beside him, Thomas turned the color of milk. "That is my property," Cole snarled, dropping the facade of the benevolent patriarch. "Sheriff, arrest her. She stole that from my private safe." "I stole it," Clara declared, her voice ringing out, "because it contains the truth you have been paying to hide for 10 years. She opened the book. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "October 1885, she read. "Payment to Sheriff Brady, $500. Reason, silence regarding the Miller water dispute." A gasp went through the crowd. "Mrs." Miller put a hand to her mouth, looking at the sheriff. Brady shifted his feet, his face flushing crimson. "January 1887, Clara continued, flipping a page. "Payment to foreman lying about the fire at the Henderson barn, $200. Mr. Henderson, who had shunned Lucas only days ago, stepped forward, his fists clenching. "You burned my barn?" he shouted at Cole. "You said it was lightning." "She is lying," Cole roared, standing up in the buggy. "She wrote those herself." "It is your handwriting, Ephraim," Clara yelled back. "And it is your signature." She turned the pages to the back, pulling out a folded letter. "And this," she said, her voice dropping to a register of deadly calm. "A letter from Thomas to his father, dated 6 months ago, detailing how he cornered a seamstress in the hallway, how he hurt her, and how much it would cost to pay the town to call her a whore instead of a victim." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a dam breaking. Clara looked at the women in the crowd, the ones who had gathered their skirts when she passed, the ones who had whispered. "You knew," she said to them. "Deep down, you knew. But it was easier to blame me than to admit that a man with money can do whatever he wants to your daughters." She looked at Thomas Cole. "I am not a fallen woman. I was pushed, and I am done falling." Thomas, panic overriding his sense, jumped from the buggy. "Shut up," he screamed. "Give me that." He lunged for her, his hand reaching for the gun in his belt. Clara did not flinch, but she did not have to fight. Silas, the storekeeper, slammed into Thomas from the side, tackling him into the mud. "Mr." Henderson joined in, grabbing Thomas's arm and pinning it to the ground. A rough justice took over as 3 other men, fueled by years of intimidation and the sudden, glaring light of truth, piled onto the cattle baron's son. Ephraim Cole reached for the shotgun under his seat, but he froze when he heard the distinct click of a hammer being pulled back. Sheriff Brady stood by the wheel of the buggy, his revolver drawn and leveled at Cole's chest. "Don't do it, Ephraim," the sheriff said softly. "I reckon I have looked the other way enough for one lifetime. You work for me," Cole hissed. "Not anymore," Brady said. He reached up and dragged Cole down from the buggy. "You are under arrest for arson, for assault, and for every other damn thing in that book." Clara stood in the center of the swirling chaos, the ledger clutched to her chest. She watched as they handcuffed Cole. She watched as the townspeople, their eyes wide with the shock of their own complicity, turned their backs on the tyrant they had served. She did not feel triumph. She felt exhausted. She turned and walked up the steps to the doctor's house, leaving the justice of men behind her. Her war was out there. Her heart was inside. The days that followed were a blur of lamplight and shadows. Lucas did not wake. The infection had set into the wound, fueled by the exposure and the blood loss. He burned with a fever that made him thrash and moan in the narrow bed in the doctor's spare room. Clara did not leave his side. She slept in a chair, her head resting on the mattress. She reversed the care he had given her in the cabin. She wiped his brow with cool cloths. She trickled water between his cracked lips. She changed the bandages, flinching at the angry red of the wound but working with steady hands. He murmured in his delirium. He called out for Sarah. He called out warnings about the fire. "I am here," Clara would whisper, smoothing the hair back from his damp forehead. "I am right here, Lucas. The fire is out. The ledgers are safe. You just have to stay." She told him stories to keep him tethered to the world. She spoke not of the past, but of the things they had promised each other in the cave. "The spring will come," she whispered in the quiet hours of the night. "The grass will grow back on the north ridge. We will have calves, red ones and white ones. We will fix the roof on the barn, and in the evenings, we will sit on the porch and I will sing for you. No smoke, no whiskey, just the wind and the song." She poured her strength into him, willing her own stubborn survival instinct to flow through her fingertips and into his veins. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. Clara had dozed off, her hand resting on his chest. She woke to the feeling of movement. Lucas was looking at her. His eyes were sunken and weary, but they were clear. The glassy haze of the fever was gone. "Clara," he rasped. It was barely a sound. Clara let out a sob that she had been holding back for days. She leaned over him, burying her face in his neck, careful of his shoulder. "You came back," she wept. "You stubborn fool, you came back." Lucas lifted his good hand and rested it on her hair. The touch was weak, but it was there. "I heard you," he whispered. "I heard you singing." The recovery was slow, but the world had changed while Lucas slept. Ephraim and Thomas Cole were transported to the county seat in shackles. The judge, seeing the ledger and the mountain of testimony from the newly emboldened citizens of Dusty Creek, denied bail. The Cole Empire, built on fear and silence, crumbled almost overnight. With Cole gone, the stranglehold on the valley loosened. Mr. Thornton from the bank rode out to the doctor's house, hat in hand. He offered Lucas a restructuring of his loan, fair terms, based on the potential of the water rights, not on a desire to steal the land, but the biggest change was in the people. Guilt is a powerful thing, but so is the desire to make amends. Neighbors who had watched the Ward Ranch burn began to show up. They didn't make speeches. They just worked. Mr. Henderson brought a wagon load of hay to feed Lucas's starving cattle. "Just until the grass comes in," he muttered, unable to meet Clara's eye. The Miller boys fixed the fencing on the north ridge. Women from the town brought casseroles and fresh bread to the ranch house, leaving them on the porch with brief, apologetic nods to Clara. They did not become friends overnight. The shame of how they had treated Clara was too fresh, too deep, but the hostility was gone, replaced by a respectful distance and small, practical acts of kindness. Clara moved back to the ranch to help Lucas while he healed. She began to sew again, taking in commissions from the town. When she walked down Main Street now, heads did not turn away. Men tipped their hats. Women murmured greetings. She was no longer the fallen woman. She was the woman who had brought down Ephraim Cole. She was the woman who had saved Lucas Ward. She sang, too. Not in the saloon. That life was over. She sang on the porch of the ranch house in the evenings, her voice drifting over the healing land. Sometimes, passing riders would stop on the road just to listen, the melody a balm on the rough, tired edges of the day. It was a Tuesday in late May when Lucas finally felt strong enough to walk the property line. The crutch was gone, replaced by a cane he barely used. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, innocent of any clouds. The air smelled of sage and new growth. The blackened scars on the north ridge were softening, hidden beneath a fuzz of bright green shoots. The earth was healing. Clara was in the garden she had started, a patch of turned earth near the house where green stems were pushing up toward the sun. She stood up when she saw him approach, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. She looked healthy. The hollows in her cheeks were gone. Her skin was golden from the sun. She looked like she belonged here, rooted in this soil as deeply as the cottonwood trees by the creek. Lucas stopped a few feet away. He leaned on his cane, watching her. His heart felt full to bursting, a sensation that still surprised him after so many years of emptiness. "The corn is coming up," she said, smiling at him. "I see that," Lucas said. "You have a green thumb." "Clara, I have a stubborn thumb," she corrected. "I just do not let them die." Lucas looked out at the horizon, then back at her. "Clara." Something in his tone made her go still. She straightened up, holding his gaze. "I have been thinking," Lucas said. He shifted his weight, nervous as a schoolboy. "About the arrangement?" You staying here, nursing me, helping with the work. I am happy to do it, Lucas, she said quietly. I know, he said. But it is not enough. Not for me. He stepped closer, closing the gap between them. I do not want a nurse. I do not want a housekeeper. And I do not want a guest. He took her hand. His grip was strong again, the calluses rough against her skin. I want a partner, he said. I want to share the work. I want to share the struggle. I want to share the bed, legally and forever. I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life and see you before I see the sun. Clara stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. She had dreamed of this, but she had never dared to expect it. She had spent her life running, or being used, or fighting to survive. The idea of a home, a real permanent home with a man who knew her darkest secrets and loved her for them, felt terrifying and wonderful. You are asking me to marry you, she whispered. I am asking you to stay, Lucas said. To be my wife, to be the heart of this place. He looked at her with such open, naked vulnerability that tears pricked her eyes. I come with a lot of ghosts. Lucas, she said, her voice trembling. The town will never fully forget. Let them remember, Lucas said fiercely. Let them remember that we survived. Let them remember that we chose each other when the whole world was against us. Clara looked at the ranch house, weather-beaten, scarred, but standing strong. She looked at the man who had ridden into a blizzard to save her. She made her choice, not out of fear, not out of necessity, but out of love. Yes, she said. The word was barely a whisper, carried away by the wind, but Lucas heard it. He dropped his cane. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. It was not the desperate embrace of the storm, nor the frantic passion of the night before the fire. It was a long, deep hold, a grounding. He kissed her, right there in the open air, under the vast western sky. It was a kiss that tasted of sunlight and promise. It was a claim. Epilogue. Time moves differently on the plains. It is measured in seasons, in the height of the grass, in the depth of the snow. Years passed over the Ward Ranch. The scars of the fire never fully disappeared. If you looked closely at the North Ridge, you could still see the blackened stumps of the old scrub oak, but the grass grew tall around them, and the herd grew fat and sleek. The ranch house expanded. A new room was added, then a larger porch. The garden became a riot of color in the summer, hollyhocks and sunflowers standing tall against the wind. Clara and Lucas worked side by side. They aged together, the sun etching lines into their faces that mirrored the lines of the land. They knew the weight of heavy snow and the worry of dry summers. They knew the exhaustion of calving season and the peace of a job done well. They were not perfect. They argued, they worried, but they never drifted apart. The bond forged in that first winter storm was unbreakable. One evening in late autumn, 10 years after the fire, they sat on the porch. The sun was setting, turning the sky into a blaze of gold and violet. The air had a bite to it, the first warning of winter coming. They sat on the swing Lucas had built, a blanket draped over their legs. Clara was humming a low tune, her head resting on Lucas's shoulder. His arm was around her, his hand holding hers. She looked at his hand, scarred, weathered, but warm. She remembered the night in the cabin, the needle and thread, the fear that had turned into salvation. She smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. She leaned up and whispered in his ear, "Don't stop." Lucas laughed, a deep, rich sound that rumbled in his chest. He turned to look at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The shadows of the past were gone, replaced by the steady light of a life well lived. He pulled her closer, kissing her forehead. "I never intend to," he said softly. "Never to stop listening, never to stop standing by you, never to stop loving you." They sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into twilight. The wind kicked up, whistling across the plains, wild and untamed. But inside the circle of their arms, there was only warmth. They were two flames in the dark, burning steady and bright, an answer to the night that would never go out. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Lucas and Clara. It has been a journey through the storm, the fire, and the healing power of love. And I am truly grateful you stayed with us until the very end. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the story resonated with you the most. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel so you never miss a new adventure. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.